58,220 American soldiers dead. Over $150 billion spent on a war that lasted nearly 2 decades. And in the end, they withdrew in despair, leaving behind scars that never truly healed in U.S. history. Have you ever wondered, how did a small country like Vietnam manage to force the world's most powerful superpower to back down? Why did America, with its unmatched military and financial strength, get trapped in a war they thought would be easy to win? Welcome to our special documentary, The Full Story of America's Invasion of Vietnam, a journey that dives deep into one of the most costly and controversial wars of the 20th century. Step by step, we'll uncover strategic miscalculations, fierce resistance from the Vietnamese people, and global reactions through authentic records, eyewitness accounts, and worldwide political responses. If you value honest history and bold perspectives with no sugarcoating, hit that subscribe button now. This journey will change the way you see the Vietnam War, forever. Part 1. The Beginning. From Colonial War to Global Confrontation, 1945 to 1955. Modern Vietnamese history is a continuous chapter woven between a nation's dream of independence and the global chessboard of great powers. Chapter 1. The End of One War, the Beginning of Another. On September 2, 1945, at Ba Dinh Square, President Ho Chi Minh solemnly declared before tens of thousands of citizens in the capital, "Vietnam has the right to be free and independent, and in fact, it is now a free and independent country." This event marked the end of nearly a century of French colonial rule, but it also signaled the opening of a new era of conflict. At that time, Vietnam was not merely a small Southeast Asian nation newly emerging from colonial chains. To the policymakers in the White House, Hanoi was more than just a capital of a newly independent country. It was a piece on the global chessboard taking shape between two opposing blocs, the Western capitalist world led by the United States, and the communist sphere backed by the Soviet Union and later China. Chapter 2. America's Emergence in the First Indochina War. At first, the United States did not intervene directly in Vietnam. Between 1945 and 1950, the U.S. publicly supported the right of colonial peoples to self-determination. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had even expressed clear anti-colonial sentiment. However, after his death, American foreign policy began to shift. The global landscape was rapidly changing. 1949, the communists took control of China. 1950, the Korean War erupted, turning East Asia into a critical flashpoint in the U.S.-Soviet confrontation. From this moment, Vietnam was no longer seen as a mere colonial issue, but rather as a crucial front in America's strategy to contain the spread of communism across Asia. Declassified U.S. State Department Memo, 1950. If Indochina falls to communism, there will be nothing to prevent its spread to Thailand, Burma, and India. Under the domino theory, the United States began providing financial and military aid to France, hoping to keep Vietnam within the sphere of Western influence and out of communist hands. Chapter 3. 1954. Dien Bien Phu and the final blow to French colonial rule. After nearly a decade of resistance, the Viet Minh forces, led by Ho Chi Minh and supported by China, had achieved several key victories across the battlefield. But the turning point came in 1954 at the legendary Battle of Dien Bien Phu. From March to May 1954, over 16,000 French expeditionary troops were surrounded and ultimately defeated in the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu. The dramatic scenes of surrendering French soldiers, exploding ammunition depots, and destroyed airstrips were broadcast around the world. Shocking images in French and American newspapers at the time captured foreign legionnaires, wounded soldiers lying helplessly in underground bunkers, and Dakota aircraft shot down on muddy runways. General Henri Navarre, the French commander at Dien Bien Phu, later admitted, "We underestimated their ability to fight and strategize. They were not just guerrilla fighters. They knew how to destroy us using conventional warfare." This event was not only a devastating military defeat, but also a political death blow. The French public and political class lost all faith in the idea of maintaining their colonial grip on Indochina. Chapter 4. The 1954 Geneva Conference. A temporary division, a long-term intervention. Following France's defeat, an international conference was convened in Geneva, Switzerland, to find a solution to the ongoing war in Indochina. The talks brought together representatives from major powers, including the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, France, and the Viet Minh. The key outcomes: France agreed to withdraw all its forces from Indochina. Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, pending a national election scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country. North Vietnam would be controlled by the Viet Minh, while the South would be governed by a pro-Western administration. However, the United States did not sign the Geneva Accords, explicitly stating that it would not be bound by the agreement's terms. John Foster Dulles, U.S. Secretary of State, declared, "We cannot allow a unifying election to take place when it is certain the Communists will win." Almost immediately after the conference, the U.S. began replacing France's role in Vietnam, investing billions of dollars, sending thousands of military and civilian advisors to Saigon, and building what they saw as a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia. The road to war. America's deepening commitment, 1955 to 1960. The Geneva Accords had drawn a temporary line across Vietnam, but for the United States, it was only the beginning of a far more permanent commitment. The fear of communist expansion, driven by Cold War ideology, began to reshape U.S. strategy in Southeast Asia. The rise of Ngo Dinh Diem. In 1955, with U.S. support, Ngo Dinh Diem became the Prime Minister and soon the President of South Vietnam after declaring the Republic of Vietnam, rejecting the planned 1956 reunification elections. Diem called off the national elections agreed upon in Geneva, citing lack of fairness in the communist-controlled North. The Eisenhower administration supported the move, with President Eisenhower later writing, "I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held as of the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the Communists." Thus, Vietnam remained divided, and the United States fully backed Diem's anti-communist regime, despite signs of authoritarianism and repression. Nation-building and suppression. From 1955 to 1960, the U.S. pumped in over $1.5 billion in aid to South Vietnam. American advisors flooded the country, helping Diem restructure the army, economy, and political system, while also supporting his brutal crackdowns on suspected communists, Buddhists, and critics. Thousands were jailed or executed under Operation Phoenix-style tactics. These measures, instead of stabilizing the South, alienated large swaths of the population. Resistance began to brew, not only from communists in the North, but also from disenfranchised Southerners. North Vietnam's strategy evolves. By the late 1950s, Ho Chi Minh's government in the North saw Diem's regime as both illegitimate and vulnerable. The promise of peaceful reunification had been broken. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a secret network of supply routes through Laos and Cambodia, began to take shape. The National Liberation Front, NLF, also known as the Viet Cong, was formed in 1960 to mobilize Southern insurgents. A Viet Cong defector later recalled, "We didn't fight for ideology. We fought because we were tortured, silenced, and our villages destroyed by Diem's men." Global context: a new phase in the Cold War. By the end of the 1950s, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had reached a fever pitch. The space race, the arms buildup, and the spread of communism in Cuba fueled American paranoia. Vietnam, in this context, was no longer just a regional issue. It was seen as a symbolic battleground in the global war for ideological. Chapter 6. From Advisors to Dominance, America raises the anti-communist banner in Indochina. By the late 1950s, the United States began shifting its role in Vietnam. From a supporter, it became a policy architect. From offering military advice, the U.S. started building intelligence networks, logistical systems, police forces, and even directly influencing the governance structure of South Vietnam. However, internally, Ngo Dinh Diem's regime grew increasingly authoritarian, cracking down on Buddhists, suppressing dissent, and deepening national division. As repression mounted, the resistance movement in the South began to rise again. According to the later released Pentagon Papers, Washington clearly saw the internal fractures within South Vietnam, yet continued to pour in money, weapons, and personnel, clinging to the unrealistic hope that Diem would reform. Escalation of war. America officially invades Vietnam, 1955-1968. The first footsteps. As the 1950s came to a close, America had already stepped deeply into Vietnamese soil, not with soldiers, but with advisors, aid, and political influence. No shots had been fired yet, but the simmering conflict between two ideologies had already begun to spread. And then, less than a decade later, the United States itself would be pulled into the very quagmire that once buried the French army. Up next, in Part 2, how did America go from advisors to combat troops? What really happened in the Gulf of Tonkin incident? And why did the world's most powerful military find itself lost in the jungles of Vietnam? Subscribe now and turn on notifications to follow the rest of this eye-opening documentary series. This is not just history. It's a reminder of what happens when power underestimates resilience.